Abortion happens every day. Millions of people around the world will have an abortion each year. But the majority of those people will never talk about their abortion experiences. What if millions of people broke their silence and told the truth about their lives and their choices? This is Melissa Madera in New York City, and you're listening to the Abortion Diary podcast. These are the stories we share.
I had an abortion a number of years ago when I was 40 years old. And I suppose the way I look at it, I needed an abortion. I didn't want an abortion, but I needed one. But I suppose from my perspective that I haven't met a woman yet who has wanted an abortion. Anyone who I know who has had an abortion has needed one. And I don't want to outline my reasons for having an abortion in this story because I think they're personal to me and they are my reasons. But I think any woman who chooses to have an abortion, then her reasons must be good enough. And I have always been concerned about the examination in public life and in the media of holding up a woman's reasons for an abortion and examining them through that lens, because it leads to a dichotomy of a good abortion and a bad abortion. And essentially what that means is there are good women and there are bad women. And I don't believe that to be true. I think anyone who takes a decision to have an abortion needs an abortion. And it's done in difficult circumstances. When I decided to have my abortion, I still had to go for counselling, and I did still have to go through the sort of medical procedure as laid down. So when I went to my doctor, who's great, who's very supportive and has been my doctor, she's actually retired now, but she's been my doctor for a long time, and I explained the circumstances, and she said to me that I didn't need to have it recorded in my medical record, and I asked her why that was. And she said, well, most people don't. So in terms of my medical record, the records record that it didn't happen. So I think that was the first question in my mind about why can't this be treated as a normal medical procedure? If I was having anything done routinely, it would be necessary that it was in my medical records, but this wasn't. And I think when it comes to, even after all the advances we have made in terms of women's rights and equal pay and many other advances in society, when it comes down to it, a woman's body isn't her own. And I suppose that was one of the things that struck me. And what this was about, it was about sex and pregnancy. So therefore, because I didn't have to record it in my medical records, there was some sort of shame and secrecy surrounding it. Now, I didn't think that immediately at the time, but it did strike me, and after a while when I processed it, that's the conclusion I reached, because it's the only one to reach. I then went to a counsellor in accordance with the process and with legislation, and the counsellor didn't try and direct me, didn't try and influence me in any way, provided the information, was extremely supportive, extremely helpful. However, on the way into that building, I encountered the so-called pro-life protesters. And I was 40 at the time, something which is just incidental, but as it turns out, it wasn't incidental to them. And I'll come to that in a wee minute as to why. But essentially the counsellor laid out the cost, what would be necessary. That is the travel. I would have to travel to either Manchester or London to have the abortion. And I earn what I consider to be a median wage. It's not a high wage, it's a median wage. And I was extremely concerned about the cost straight off. And I thought, what does anyone do who doesn't have the money? I didn't have the money, but I thought if you were on a low income, if you were young and you didn't have a job, if you're a migrant worker, If you were someone who didn't have access to any funds and you had to do it in secrecy, if you were on a low income, if you were on benefit, what would you do to meet this cost? And I put mine on my credit card, and I paid it off for quite some time after, with interest as well. But that's what I had to do. I'd made the decision, and that was necessary. So I balked at the cost, not just because of what it would cost me, but because of what it cost in general. I wasn't expecting that. There was then a whole series of things that you had to do. You had to book flights. You had to book the clinic and do all of that, and that's just part of the process. I left the clinic that day, and I was approached by 3 protesters, 2 women and 1 man. One of them stood in front of me and gave me a leaflet, and it was a woman who I think was younger than me, and she said that, do you know a woman of your age is more likely to contract breast cancer if you have an abortion? Now, I knew it to be untrue. I had seen these protesters before in town, with different display boards and and sort of claims about things, from quacks and doctors, and they could never be confirmed or verified. About what would happen if you had an abortion. But I thought it was, I dealt with it, and I moved on. I had a brief engagement with them, which wasn't particularly hostile. However, it just struck me that, that they had profiled me almost when I had walked into the clinic without knowing anything about my circumstances, who I was, my health, or anything else. And later on, I thought, do they do that to every woman that comes in? Do they look at her and think, well, she's of a particular background or age, or do they profile women in that way? And do they come out with something that's going to scare them, terrify them, intimidate them, or manipulate them? Because that's what it is. And I stopped wondering, because after engaging with people who've had abortions, and that's exactly what they do. I'm aware of one woman who accompanied her daughter, and she was told that she would never be a grandmother and she was killing her grandchild. And they said that because her daughter was 18, 19. I wondered, what sort of other stories did they tell women from one glance? And I thought, I don't think that that's protest. I think that that's abuse. And I think it's manipulation, I have to say, at best, and at worst it's abuse. And I certainly felt abused by it, aside from the fact it's completely untrue. It concerned me and upset me greatly. So after that, after a few weeks, I went and had the abortion in Manchester. I travelled with my partner, who was extremely supportive, and my abortion was had in what I can only describe as the best of circumstances. I don't think it's ever taken, and I don't think the circumstances are good when you have to have an abortion. They never are, but it wasn't hugely traumatic, and it's worse for a lot of other people, and that's the way I looked at it. So I travelled with my partner. I booked a Friday flight, so I could recover over the weekend, because I couldn't afford to take time off work. I lied to my employer, because nobody ever walks in and says, I have to have an abortion, and I have to take a couple of days out to travel. Is that okay? That doesn't happen. Women aren't in the place where it's viewed that way. So I travelled to Manchester. I had the abortion, and again, the clinic was professional. They were supportive. I had it was a surgical abortion under general anaesthetic, and it was straightforward, and that was okay. I had to travel home, and I decided to travel home that same night. I understand people can't stay overnight deciding on what type of abortion they want to have, but I wanted to get home. That's what I wanted to do, and get back to my own house, and my own home. So on the way back to the airport, I began to feel ill. And when we reached the airport, I felt worse again. And I was aware what it was. I knew what it was because it had happened before. I had taken a reaction to the anaesthetic, because I can't take anti-sickness tablets. And that's just a common reaction. No matter what procedure you have, that's just a common reaction. However, I became extremely ill and I passed out at the airport. And my partner was upset. Staff in the airport were upset. I hadn't actually checked in for the flight at that point. It was just still in the departures area. And I came around pretty quickly, but I soon realised that if I said that I had had an abortion, that they wouldn't let me travel because it's classed as surgery. So the attendant got me a chair. Water was very helpful, and he asked me had I taken something like drugs, and I said no, I hadn't, that I just was feeling unwell and had a bit of a temperature. I was aware that I still had a plaster on my hand from the anaesthetic, and I was trying to cover it up so that he wouldn't realise that I had some sort of procedure, and it was just generally very distressing. My partner got a wheelchair for me because I couldn't walk, because my legs were just unstable, and for the next 4 hours I sat waiting for the plane and essentially going between the toilet and the chair, being sick and just being very ill, and essentially trying to stay conscious and trying to hold it together. What struck me was there was a woman in the airport. There was actually two women in the airport. There was one with a Southern Irish accent and one with a Northern Irish accent. And one boarded the plane later on, the woman with the Northern Irish accent. But I had met them in the clinic earlier that day. And they were sitting in this it's a small airport, so they were sitting in close proximity. But we didn't, and they were right next to me in the clinic, and I thought in normal circumstances you would say hello, or you would nod to somebody, or you might have small chat, but we didn't. And we didn't because everyone knew the other person had had an abortion, and it was just best forgotten. So, that kind of struck me. And when the person boarded the plane later on, that was the same thing. But so eventually got on the plane. It drew the attention of another attendant, on the flight attendant, who asked if I was well enough to fly, and I just panicked at the thought of not being allowed on the plane, not being allowed to fly home, not getting to my bed, having to spend the night in a hotel. And I thought, a lot of women have to do that, actually. They have to go and spend the night in a hotel or a grubby hostel, and that's a reality for them, and how awful that is. It's the added burden of having to travel. Now, the sickness was just a routine thing. There wasn't anything sinister behind it. It wasn't anything serious. I had had a routine procedure. I had reacted badly to the anaesthetic. That's not the bit that I'm angry about. It's the fact that in other circumstances, I would have been able to go home and go to my bed, but I couldn't. I had to sit propped up in a wheelchair, trying not to draw attention to myself in an airport, with my partner, who was also distressed at that stage, and being physically ill. And I thought, there's an inhumanity about that. Why should you be forced to do that? Why should you? So travelled home, got home eventually, and was never so glad to see it. I got up the next day, and physically I was fine. There was nothing to be concerned about. But I had an anger, and I had a real anger about what I was forced to do. And I thought about all the other women who were on the plane that week, that month, that year, and who had to do it in the same circumstances, and actually in much worse circumstances. I thought about the women who genuinely couldn't afford to do it, who didn't have a credit card, who didn't have a partner to travel with them, who had taken the decision to have an abortion in maybe traumatic circumstances. And I think that anger has never left me. And I think there is an inhumanity about the aspect of travel. Not to mention everything else surrounding abortion law in this country. I listened to a male relative who I talked to a couple of weeks later, not about the abortion, but he had a knee operation, and he talked about how he had travelled. He had to travel to England to have it. The operation was paid for. He was put up in a hotel, and he was treated very well, and his flights there and back were paid for. And I thought, well, that's right and that's proper. And why is that so very difficult for women who have to have abortions in Northern Ireland? Why can they not be subjected to the same treatment? Why is that so very hard? So that's my story.
Can you tell me a little bit about what happened when you went to your GP's office?
Yeah, when I went to my doctor, she didn't give me any direction in terms of what was available to me in the terms of abortion. It really wasn't. I could tell that she dealt with it before. Obviously, she dealt with it before. It's necessary. You have to go to a medical practitioner, and I doubt I was the first woman to walk into a clinic and say I have to have an abortion. But she didn't provide any direction in terms of where I should go or what I should do or what type of abortion I should have or what options were available to me. That is seen as something which is outside that, that type of medical practice. You have to go elsewhere for it. And I don't think that, I don't know what her position is. Having been my doctor for a long time, I would be surprised if her position wasn't one of choice. But doctors here can't do that. That's the point. They can't do it, or there are repercussions and ramifications for them, potentially at the very least, and that's enough to stop on someone saying, well, I can't do that. And that's the awful thing about it. It's not seen as a routine medical procedure, so therefore your own doctor and the person who knows you and knows your health best can't advise you. I don't think she was making a moral judgment. I didn't get that sense at all that she was making a moral judgment. She was making a call because of what society forces her to do as much as it does me.
So how did you navigate figuring out what to do next?
I think I must have. I'm trying to recall how I knew where to go, and I didn't discuss it with anyone. You don't discuss it with friends, and they say, "Oh, you need to contact such and such to set an abortion up." I probably Googled it. That's probably what I did. I probably looked it up on the internet, and I would say abortion is commonly looked up in the internet in this part of the world. I would imagine that's the case. So that's probably was my starting point. There's not so many places you can go to get that sort of information, unfortunately.
So where did you end up going, and what happened next?
Oh, in terms of organising the travel and so forth, I went to the Family Planning Association, the FPA, and the FPA give people all sorts of advice about pregnancy, about contraception, about planning for a family, if you want to continue with the pregnancy or not. So I went to them, and they have counsellors. It's a free service, but I subsequently found out that their funding has been cut substantially, and they are constantly under threat of closure. Threat of funding cut, and there's no doubt in my mind that's because of the view of the type of service they deliver, and it's so necessary and it's so important, because I think it's the only place where you can go to get that sort of advice. But I went, and there was a counsellor there, and the counsellor, I explained the circumstances. The counsellor was very thorough. When she there's a questionnaire that they have to go through with you, but she was also very thorough in exploring reasons why I wanted an abortion. In fact, you have to sign something to say why, and so, but she did not try and influence me in any way. She explored it with me, and then from there she provided the advice on just logistical advice in terms of the clinics available, where they were, how you might get there, and other options available to me as well. She gave me literature, as well as explaining it all verbally. So that was, of course, it was extremely useful, and where would you be without it,
Can you talk a little bit about the clinic that you went to and the procedure and all that happened when you were at the clinic?
Yeah. The clinic was in Manchester, and the procedure is, you go in, obviously you're booked in beforehand. So you go in, you give your details, there is a waiting area, and my partner went to the waiting area. So when you go through to have your sort of initial checkups, you are you're on your own. You're not accompanied. So you meet with a nurse first of all. Now it takes a few hours to go through this process because the clinic is busy, and it's also a family planning clinic. So there's people having contraceptive devices fitted and advice given, and for other reasons related to sexual health and pregnancy as well. But you are then sort of examined by a nurse who will take your weight, your height, sort of all routine procedure, and do a couple of tests, and do a questionnaire, and then you go to see a doctor. Then he scans you, checks that you are pregnant, checks how far along you are, which is one of the details that actually struck me, because you have to wait a certain length of time in Northern Ireland before you can travel for a surgical abortion, and that's in case you have to go back and revisit the clinic because you can't do it here. So there's that added complication as well. But the doctor then confirms you're pregnant, will give you some sexual health advice and contraceptive advice. We'll ask you questions about, what circumstances you've taken the decision to have an abortion in. Are you sure about it? Is there any support that you'll need? Supportive, helpful, no difficulty. You are then moved to a ward, and you have to wait maybe, so it's a ward, you get undressed, you put a surgical gown on, and it's busy, and it was probably a little cramped as well. There's other women there in very close proximity, and then they take you down to a waiting area, and then they take you into into surgery, essentially is what it is. I chose to have a general anaesthetic. You can have a local anaesthetic if you wish. So essentially they give you the anaesthetic, they carry out the procedure, and when you wake up, you're in a waiting room, and there's maybe 10 other women and that, sorry, it's not a waiting room, it's a recovery room. Then they give you some time to recover. They move you, a nurse comes round and takes, takes tests, takes, your pulse, does all that, checks all your obs, does the obs, essentially, and then you are moved back up to the ward for recovery period and given some food and medication if you wish to prevent the sickness. And then when you're ready to leave, you can leave. That's how it works. It's very straightforward, and you're led through the process.
When you talked about your experience with the protesters outside of the clinic here in Belfast, you got very emotional. What was it about that experience that was really made you feel very emotional, remembering that experience?
I think that makes me more emotional than actually having the abortion, because to me the abortion was a straightforward thing. I think it's because what they chose to say to me, and I felt it invaded me. It invaded me as a person. Number one, they didn't know what age I was. They could only guess at that. But I think to use a woman's disease, such as breast cancer, to scare a woman and then say you want to protect that woman is hideous. I find it not only a contradiction, but I find it absolutely, I find it abhorrent that they would do that. It's just wrong on so many levels. And I thought, and when they said it, I knew that this isn't the first time they've done it. I'm not the first person they've said this to. But it just made me wonder about, and I pass that clinic very regularly. And it made me, and I see people going in and out, and I see different types of women. So do they look at someone who's scared going in? Do they look at a woman who's maybe on her own and scared and say, do you know people might find out about this? Did they look at the young woman and say, oh, you'll regret this for the rest of your life? Did they look at the woman, the mother accompanying her daughter, and say, you're killing your grandchild? And they do. That is exactly what they do. And, I think that is, to strike fear, into people and into women like that, on one hand, and say on the other that you're doing it to protect women. I think it's anti-women, and I think that's what upset me so much about it. I was sort of half expecting them. They didn't mention God once. They weren't angry and they weren't aggressive, and they didn't, so I think it was that quiet, awful manipulation that they did. It didn't work on me. It upsets me now thinking about it, and it did upset me then. It didn't work, but I thought maybe it works on some people, and maybe it influences their decision to choose whether to have an abortion or not, and that is interfering with a woman's bodily autonomy, and that's what it boils down to. That's what it's doing. That's what that process of manipulation is doing. So that's why I'm upset about it.
Could you tell me how much did the procedure cost, plus the travel? Like, what was the whole expense of having to travel to England to get an abortion?
All in all, it was around £1,300. When you sort of add everything in, one of the complications I had was I had to book an extra flight because the clinic got the appointment wrong. They had double booked, which is, that happens. They didn't charge me for that, obviously, but I had already booked the flights for myself and my partner, and they said that they would reimburse my flights, but they wouldn't reimburse my partner's. So I had to pay for an extra set of flights, which wasn't hugely expensive, but added to the cost, it was. So that was a kind of a complication with it. But even without that, it probably would have cost probably in and around £1,150 or thereabouts. And then when you take into consideration, whatever else you have to buy, meals, whatever else. Now, I didn't eat, in fairness, after I'd had the surgery, I didn't eat, I couldn't eat. But yeah, it was expensive. And I didn't have, most people don't have £1,300 lying around. You have to pay it up front. There's no choice. And I wasn't aware of any help that I could get with it because it's not talked about. And that information isn't out there. And I thought there's probably people who need the help more than I do financially, as well. I suppose it was an element of that. But it took me a long time to pay it off, and it was paid with interest as well.
So you talked about the added element that people don't talk about it. Did you tell anyone in your circle about it? Did you get support from anyone else?
No, you just don't do it. I talk about it now, but not for no reason. So I didn't tell. I have children already. I didn't tell them. I didn't want them to be upset about it. I didn't tell my family for some time, and when I did, it was for a particular reason. I haven't discussed it with friends, and the reason that I tell my story now is because I'm now involved in abortion rights activism, and it's not something that you do. However, when I did start talking about it for those reasons, what I found was the amount of women who've had abortions, because and since I've started doing abortion rights activism, when you do stalls, when you do meetings, or when you speak to a group of women, if you're delivering education sessions or whatever it is, the amount of women who will tell you that they have had an abortion, that their mother, their sister, their aunt, their cousin, their friend has had an abortion is incredible. And it's like a weight off their shoulders as soon as they tell you. And they'll say, I haven't told anyone this, or I haven't told many people this, but now I'm not afraid to say it. So I think telling my story is not about getting it off my chest, or it's about creating that space so that women can talk about having abortions, or not if they choose. That's their decision, but it's just not done in this society. It's just not done, because there are so many levels of moral judgment about it, and I think I grew up where the sort of anti-abortion message was on our school curriculum. I mean, it's hard for people to get their heads around. It was there in the curriculum. You were taught it from a young age, and if you didn't take that stance, in fact, you were more than taught it. It was in, it was in exam papers, and you had to, you had to demonstrate that answer, and you were marked on it. So to try and and when you're brought up in that environment, and it's also in other places all around, to shake that off is a very difficult thing, and that's the society that we're brought up in, and that's the society that we live in. So that's very much part of it, part of why we don't or won't talk about it.
Is it something you'd like to be able to talk about more openly?
Of course. Now I do see a shift in that. I think abortion is being talked about more openly. It's a huge debate, as we know, at the minute. It became a political debate in the recent elections. It's certainly in the media. The legislation is one angle. There's a political angle to it. There's a religious angle to it. But in terms of a woman's story, I see that starting to change, but it certainly hasn't changed enough. And there are certain quarters where women can share their story, but there aren't enough of them. And, I would like to see that more. It's not to say women want to run around talking about their abortions. They don't. But women don't want to hide anymore. They don't want to hide it anymore. And I think that's the thing that I've come to realise. I think that, women are probably sharing their abortion stories, but it's in small corners and sort of in certain spaces. And that needs to change.
And you said you started talking more openly about abortion since you got involved in abortion rights activism.
Mm-hmm.
How did you get involved?
Well, I've always been an activist. I suppose I've always been a left wing activist anyway, and I'm a trade unionist as well. And I suppose, like anything, there's something which motivates you to do those things. I've always had a pro-choice stance, and I've raised my children that way, and I'm proud that I have. But I think that I didn't actually know what it meant until I had had an abortion, in those circumstances. And not only that, when I started talking to other women who had, then I started to realise this isn't going to change through simply legislation. It isn't going to change, leaving it to the media isn't going to change it. It has to be changed from below. And the only way I'm going to do that is to get involved, get my hands dirty, and try and bring about that change. So I suppose that was the turning point. It's always a series of things. There's never one Damascene moment where you think, right, okay, I need to do this. This needs to happen, and you can never do it on your own. And at the end of the day, it's not about me. Relating your personal story is one thing, but it's obviously about much more than that. But I don't think I fully understood it until I had the experience and talked to others who have as well, because not all abortion rights activists have had abortions either. But I think when you become more involved in it, then you start to realise how wrong it is. How wrong.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it is something that you'll share with your kids one day, or with other family members or people in your community?
I have now. I've told my children and I've told my family. That was for a particular reason. And actually their reactions were absolutely fine about it. I don't think that's the same for all women. And actually my mother said to me, I'm really surprised that you didn't tell me. And I said, well, why would I? Why would I tell you? And she doesn't have conservative views. She doesn't, she believes in a woman's right to choose what's best for her. And my daughters were the same. I have two daughters, and they were the same. They said, why didn't you tell me? And I said, well, I didn't think it was necessary. But I'm relieved that I did. It's nearly like a relief. I think if needs be, I could share it with my community, but I have no doubt that I would lose friends if I shared it. I have no doubt that judgment would be somewhere, along the way, and I think it would affect relationships, and that's got less to do with me and more to do with the way this society views abortion.
Yeah, and you were able to talk to your partner and find support from him.
I was, and that, that wasn't a difficulty at all. He's extremely supportive, and I would expect nothing less from him, I have to say. But I just wonder, people who have to maybe hide it, or, people who are on their own, or people who have had, a pregnancy and crisis pregnancies in really, really difficult circumstances, or people who have are in maybe abusive relationships. I can't imagine, what it must be like for them, because really at that time my partner was the only person I could speak to about it, but it was firmly my decision. It was firmly my decision, as it should be.
Why do you want to share your story?
I suppose it goes back to, I really think there's not enough of these spaces for women to share their stories. It's a relief. It always feels like a relief when you share your story. From a personal point of view as well, but when you do it and you're not being judged about it, But I also think, and this is the most important thing for me, it's about normalising abortion. That's what it's about. And every little turn of the wheel, you know, will help us get there. So if I can share one story, and there's lots of other women doing that as well, then, you know, that's another little turn, you know. I suppose that's the way to look at it. And there's lots of different ways, you know, to become involved in abortion rights activism. This is one of them. But I also think it's really, really important to hear from women themselves. Really important to hear from women themselves who have lived it and the impact on them. Because we hear from the media, we hear what the judges say, we hear what the lawyers say, we hear what the legislators say, we hear what the politicians say, we hear what the church leaders say, but and we hear what the medical practitioners say. Very, very rarely do we get to hear what the women who have had abortions or who might need an abortion have to say. So I think that's why I shared my story.
Thank you. How does it feel now that you've shared it for the podcast?
It feels good, I suppose, which is a strange thing to say. But I hope it encourages other women to do the same. And I hope it contributes in some way. You know, you can take that experience and try and change things for the future and for all the other women who are going to have abortions, because it will continue to happen. That's the fact of life, and that's reality. It always has. And if it can change, if it can help in any little way, any little tiny way, to change what is regressive abortion legislation that prevails in this part of the world, then I celebrate sharing my story.
This is Melissa, and thanks again for listening. You can continue to listen to our stories online through our website by subscribing on iTunes or SoundCloud or your favorite podcast app. And if you rate and review our podcast on iTunes, it helps new listeners find us by boosting our iTunes ranking. And remember, the Abortion Diary needs your support. Help the Abortion Diary continue its work and share our stories by donating, and consider supporting us with a monthly gift. I'll be back next week with a new story. New stories are posted every Tuesday. Until then, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, and Instagram. Listen for us next week.